The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. Prologue. When Ideas Have Sex. In other classes of animals, the individual advances from infancy to age or maturity, and he attains, in the compass of a single life, to all the perfection his nature can reach. But in the humankind, the species has a progress as well as the individual. They build in every subsequent age on foundations formerly laid. Adam Ferguson, an essay on the history of civil society. On my desk, as I write, sit two artifacts of roughly the same size and shape. One is a cordless computer mouse. The other, a hand axe from the Middle Stone Age, 500,000 years old. Both are designed to fit the human hand, to obey the constraints of being used by human beings, but they are vastly different. One is a complex confection of many substances with intricate internal design, reflecting multiple strands of knowledge. The other is a single substance reflecting the skill of a single individual. The differences between them show that the human experience of today is vastly different from the human experience 500,000 years ago. This book is about the rapid, continuous, and incessant change that human society experiences in a way that no other animal does. To a biologist, this is something that needs explaining. In the past 2 decades, I have written 4 books about how similar human beings are to other animals. This book is about how different they are from other animals. What is it about human beings that enables them to keep changing their lives in this tumultuous way? It is not as if human nature changes. Just as the hand that held the hand axe was the same shape as the hand that holds the mouse, so people always have and always will seek food, desire sex, care for offspring, compete for status, and avoid pain, just like any other animal. Many of the idiosyncrasies of the human species are unchanging too. You can travel to the farthest corner of the earth and expect to encounter singing, smiling, speech, sexual jealousy, and a sense of humor, none of which you will find to be the same in a chimpanzee. You could travel back in time and empathize easily with the motives of Shakespeare, Homer, Confucius, and the Buddha. If I could meet the man who painted the exquisite images of rhinos on the wall of the Chauvet cave in southern France 30,000 years ago, I have no doubt that I would find him fully human in every physiological way. There is a great deal of human change that does not change. Yet to say that life is the same as it was 32,000 years ago would be absurd. In the same time, my species has multiplied by 100,000%, from perhaps 3 million to nearly 7 billion people. It has given itself comforts and luxuries to a level that no other species can even imagine. It has colonized every habitable corner of the planet and explored almost every uninhabitable one. It has altered the appearance, the genetics, and the chemistry of the world, and pinched perhaps 23% of the productivity of all land plants for its own purposes. It has surrounded itself with peculiar, non-random arrangements of atoms called technologies, which it invents, reinvents, and discards almost continuously. This is not true for other creatures, not even brainy ones like chimpanzees, bottlenose dolphins, parrots, and octopuses. They may occasionally use tools, they may occasionally shift their ecological niche, but they do not raise their standard of living or experience economic growth. They do not encounter poverty either. They do not progress from one mode of living to another, nor do they deplore doing so. They do not experience agriculture, urban, commercial, industrial, and information revolutions, let alone renaissances, reformations, depressions, demographic transitions, civil wars, cold wars, culture wars, and credit crunches. As I sit here at my desk, I am surrounded by things: telephones, books, computers, photographs, paper clips, coffee mugs, that no monkey has ever come close to making. I am spilling digital information onto a screen in a way that no dolphin has ever imagined. I am aware of abstract concepts: the date, the weather forecast, the second law of thermodynamics, that no parrot could begin to grasp. I am definitely different. What is it that makes me so different? It cannot just be that I have a bigger brain than other humans. After all, late Neanderthals had on average bigger brains than I do, yet did not experience this headlong cultural change. Moreover, big though my brain may be compared with other animal species, I have barely the foggiest inkling how to make coffee cups and paper clips, let alone weather forecasts. The psychologist Daniel Gilbert likes to joke that every member of his profession lives under the obligation at some time in his career to complete a sentence which begins, "The human being is the only animal that... Language, cognitive reasoning, fire, cooking, tool making, self-awareness, deception, imitation, art, religion, opposable thumbs, throwing weapons, upright stance, grandparental care." The list of features suggested as unique to human beings is long indeed. But the list of features unique to aardvarks, or barefaced go-away birds, is also fairly long. All of these features are indeed uniquely human and indeed very helpful in enabling modern life. But I will contend that, with the possible exception of language, none of them arrived at the right time or had the right impact in human history to explain the sudden change from a merely successful ape man to an ever-expanding, progressive modernizer. Most of them came much too early in the story and had no such ecological effect. Having sufficient consciousness to want to paint your body or to reason the answer to a problem is nice, but it does not lead to ecological world conquest. Clearly, big brains and language may be necessary for human beings to cope with a life of technological modernity. Clearly, human beings are very good at social learning. Indeed, compared with even chimpanzees, humans are almost obsessively interested in faithful imitation. But big brains and imitation and language are not themselves the explanation of prosperity and progress and poverty. They do not themselves deliver a changing standard of living. Neanderthals had all of these things: huge brains, probably complex languages, lots of technology, but they never burst out of their niche. It is my contention that in looking inside our heads, we would be looking in the wrong place to explain this extraordinary capacity for change in the species. It was not something that happened within a brain. It was something that happened between brains. It was a collective phenomenon. Look again at the hand axe and the mouse. They are both man-made, but one was made by a single person, the other by hundreds of people, maybe even millions. This is what I mean by collective intelligence. No single person knows how to make a computer mouse. The person who assembled it in the factory did not know how to drill the oil well from which the plastic came, or vice versa. At some point, human intelligence became collective and cumulative in a way that happened to no other animal. Mating minds. To argue that human nature has not changed, but human culture has, does not mean rejecting evolution. Quite the reverse. Humanity is experiencing an extraordinary burst of evolutionary change driven by good old-fashioned Darwinian natural selection. But it is selection among ideas, not among genes. The habitat in which these ideas reside consists of human brains. This notion has been trying to surface in the social sciences for a long time. The French sociologist Gabriel Tard wrote in 1888, "We may call it social evolution when an invention quietly spreads through imitation." The Austrian-French economist Friedrich Hayek wrote in the 1960s that in social evolution, the decisive factor is selection by imitation of successful institutions and habits. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in 1976 coined the term meme for a unit of cultural imitation. The economist Richard Nelson in the 1980s proposed that whole economies evolve by natural selection. This is what I mean when I talk of cultural evolution. At some point before 100,000 years ago, culture itself began to evolve in a way that it did not in any other species. That is, to replicate, mutate, compete, select, and accumulate, somewhat as genes had been doing for billions of years, but the natural selection cumulatively building an eye bit by bit. So cultural evolution in human beings could cumulatively build a culture or a camera. Chimpanzees may teach each other how to spear bush babies with sharpened sticks, and killer whales may teach others how to snatch sea lions off beaches. But only human beings have the cumulative culture that goes into the design of a loaf of bread or a concerto. Yes, but why? Why us and not killer whales? To say that people have cultural evolution is neither very original nor very helpful. Imitation and learning are not themselves enough, however richly and ingeniously they are practiced, to explain why human beings began changing in this unique way. Something else is necessary, something that human beings have and killer whales do not. The answer, I believe, is that at some point in human history, ideas began to meet and mate, to have sex with one another. Let me explain. Sex is what makes biological evolution cumulative, because it brings together the genes of different individuals. A mutation that occurs in one creature can therefore join forces with a mutation that occurs in another. The analogy is most explicit in bacteria, which trade genes without replicating at the same time, hence their ability to acquire immunity to antibiotics from other species. If microbes had not begun swapping genes a few billion years ago, and animals had not continued doing so through sex, all the genes that make eyes could never have gotten together in one animal, nor the genes to make legs or nerves or brains. Each mutation would have remained isolated in its own lineage, unable to discover the joys of synergy. Think in cartoon terms of one fish evolving a nascent lung, another nascent limbs, and getting out of land. Evolution can happen without sex, but is far, far slower. And so it is with culture. If culture consisted simply of learning habits from others, it would soon stagnate. For culture to turn cumulative, ideas needed to meet and mate. The cross-fertilization of ideas is a cliche, but one with unintentional fecundity. To create is to recombine, said the molecular biologist Francois Jacob. Imagine if the man who invented the railway and the man who invented the locomotive could never meet or speak to each other, even through third parties. Paper and printing and the printing press, the internet and the mobile phone, coal and turbines, copper and tin, the wheel and steel, software and hardware. I shall argue that there was a point in human prehistory when big-brained, cultural, learning people for the first time began to exchange things with each other, and that once they started doing so, culture suddenly became cumulative, and the great headlong experiment of human economic quote-unquote progress began. Exchange is to cultural evolution as sex is to biological evolution. By exchanging, human beings discovered the division of labor, the specialization of efforts and talents for mutual gain. It would at first have seemed an insignificant thing missed by passing primatologists had they driven their time machines to the moment when it was just starting. It would have seemed much less interesting than the ecology, hierarchy, and superstitions of the species. But some ape men had become exchanging food or tools with others in such a way that both partners to the exchange were better off, and both were becoming more specialized. Specialization encouraged innovation because it encouraged the investment of time in a tool-making tool. The save time and prosperity is simply time saved, which is proportional to the division of labor. The more human beings diversified as consumers and specialized as producers, and the more they then exchanged, the better off they have been, are, and will be. And the good news is that there is no inevitable end to this process. The more people are drawn into the global division of labor, the more people can specialize and exchange, the wealthier we'll all be. Moreover, along the way, there is no reason we cannot solve the problem that beset us of economic crashes, population explosions, climate change and terrorism, of poverty, AIDS, depression, and obesity. It will not be easy, but it is perfectly possible, indeed probable, that in the year 2110, a century after this book is published, humanity will be much, much better off than it is today, and so will the ecology of the planet it inhabits. This book dares the human race to embrace change, to be rationally optimistic, and thereby to strive for the betterment of humankind and the world it inhabits. Some will say that I am merely restating what Adam Smith said in 1776. But much has happened since Adam Smith to change, challenge, adjust, and amplify his insight. He did not realize, for instance, that he was living through the early stages of an industrial revolution. I cannot hope to match Smith's genius as an individual, but I have one great advantage over him. I can read his book. Smith's own insight has mated with others since his day. Moreover, I find myself continuously surprised by how few people think about the problem of tumultuous cultural change. I find the world is full of people who think that their dependence on others is decreasing, or that they would be better off if they were just more self-sufficient, or the technological progress has brought no improvement in the standard of living, or the world is steadily deteriorating, or the exchange of things and ideas is a superfluous irrelevance. And I find a deep incuriosity among the trained economists, of which I am not one, about defining what prosperity is, why it happened to their species. So I thought I would satisfy my own curiosity by writing this book. I am writing in times of unprecedented economic pessimism. The world banking system has lurched to the brink of collapse. An enormous bubble of debt has burst. World trade has contracted. Unemployment is rising sharply all around the world as output falls. The immediate future looks bleak indeed, and some governments are planning further enormous public debt expansions that could hurt the next generation's ability to prosper. To my intense regret, I played a part in one phase of this disaster as non-executive chairman of Northern Rock, one of the many banks that ran short of liquidity during the financial crisis. This is not a book about that experience. Under the terms of my employment, there I am not at liberty to write about it. The experience has left me mistrustful of markets in capital and assets, yet passionately in favor of markets in goods and services. Had I only known, experiments in laboratories by the economist Vernon Smith and his colleagues have long formed that markets in goods and services for immediate consumption, haircuts and hamburgers, work so well that it is hard to design them so that they fail to deliver efficiency and innovation. While markets and assets are so automatically prone to bubbles and crashes, it is hard to design them so they work at all. Speculation, herd exuberance, irrational optimism, rent sinking, and the temptation of fraud drive asset markets to overshoot and plunge, which is why they need careful regulation, something I always supported. Markets in goods and services need less regulation. But what made the bubble of the 2000s so much worse than most government housings and monetary policy, especially in the United States, which sluiced artificially cheap money towards bad risks as a matter of policy, and thus also towards the middlemen of capital markets. The crisis has at least as much political as economic causation, which is why I also mistrust too much government. In the interest of full disclosure, I here note that as well as banking, I have over the years worked in or profited directly from scientific research, species conservation, journalism, farming, coal mining, venture capital, and commercial property, among other things. Experience may have influenced and has certainly informed my views of these sectors in the pages that follow, but I have never been paid to promulgate a particular view. Rational optimism holds that the world will pull out of the current crisis because of the way that markets and goods, services, and ideas allow human beings to exchange and specialize honestly for the betterment of all. So this is not a book of unthinking praise or condemnation of all markets, but it is an inquiry into how the market process of exchange and specialization is older and fairer than many think, and gives a vast reason for optimism about the future of the human race. Above all, it is a book about the benefits of change. I find that my disagreement is mostly with reactionaries of all political colors, blue ones who dislike cultural change, red ones who dislike economic change, and green ones who dislike technological change. I am a rational optimist. Rational because I have arrived at optimism not through temperament or instinct, but by looking at the evidence. In the pages that follow, I hope to make you a rational optimist too. First, I need to convince you that the human progress has, on balance, been a good thing, and that despite the constant temptation to moan, the world is as good a place to live as it has ever been for the average human being, even now in a deep recession. That it is richer, healthier, and kinder too, as much because of commerce as despite it. Then I intend to explain why and how I got that way. And finally, I intend to see whether it can go on getting better. Chapter 2: The Collective Brain. Innovation Networks. According to the anthropologist Joe Henrich, human beings learn skills from each other by copying prestigious individuals, and they innovate by making mistakes that are very occasionally improvements. That is how culture evolves. The bigger the connected population, the more skilled the teacher, and the bigger the probability of a productive mistake. Conversely, the smaller the connected population, the greater the steady deterioration of the skill as it is passed on. Because they depend on wild resources, hunter-gatherers could rarely live in bands larger than a few hundred and could never achieve modern population densities. This had an important consequence. It meant that there was a limit to what they could invent. A band of 100 people cannot sustain more than a certain number of tools, for the simple reason that both the production and consumption of tools require a minimum size of market. People will only learn a limited set of skills if there are not enough experts to learn one rare skill from. They will lose that skill. A good idea, manifest in bone, stone, or string, needs to be kept alive by numbers. Progress can easily falter and turn to regress. Where modern hunter-gatherers have been deprived of access to a large population of trading partners in sparsely populated Australia, especially Tasmania and the Andaman Islands, for example, their technological virtuosity was stunted and barely progressed beyond those of Neanderthals. There was nothing special about the brains of the moderns. It was the trade networks that made the difference, their collective brains. The most striking case of technological regress is Tasmania. Isolated on an island at the end of the world, a population of less than 5,000 hunter-gatherers divided into 9 tribes did not just stagnate or fail to progress. They fell steadily and gradually back into a simpler toolkit and lifestyle, purely because they lacked the numbers to sustain their existing technology. Human beings reached Tasmania at least 35,000 years ago, while it was still connected to Australia. It remained connected, on and off, until about 10,000 years ago, when the rising seas filled the Bass Strait. Thereafter, the Tasmanians were isolated. By the time Europeans first encountered Tasmanian natives, they found them not only to lack many of the skills and tools of their mainland cousins, but to lack many technologies that their own ancestors had once possessed. They had no bone tools of any kind, such as needles or awls, no cold weather clothing, no fish hooks, no hafted tools, no barbed spears, no fish traps, no spear throwers, no boomerangs. A few of these had been invented on the mainland after the Tasmanians had been isolated from it, the boomerang, for instance, but most had been made and used by the very first Tasmanians, steadily and inexorably, so the archaeological history tells us. These tools and tricks were abandoned. Bone tools, for example, grew simpler and simpler until they dropped altogether about 3,800 years ago. Without bone tools, it became impossible to sew skins into clothes. So even in the bitter winter, the Tasmanians went nearly naked, but for seal fat grease smeared on their skin and wallaby pelts over their shoulders. The first Tasmanians caught and ate plenty of fish, but by the time of Western contact, they not only ate no fish and had eaten none for 3,000 years, but they were disgusted to be offered it, though they happily ate shellfish. The story is not quite that simple, because the Tasmanians did invent a few things during their isolation. Around 4,000 years ago, they came up with a horribly unreliable form of canoe raft made of bundles of rushes and either paddled by men or pushed by swimming women, which enabled them to reach offshore islets to harvest birds and seals. The raft would become waterlogged and disintegrate or sink after a few hours, so it was no good for reestablishing contact with the mainland. As far as innovation goes, it was so unsatisfactory that it almost counts as an exception to prove the rule. The women also learned to dive up to 12 feet below the water to prize clams off the rocks with the wooden wedges and to grab lobsters. This was dangerous and exhausting work, which they were very skilled at. The men did not partake. So it was not that there was no innovation. It was that regress overwhelmed progress. The archaeologist who first described the Tasmanian regress, Rhys Jones, called it a case of the slow strangulation of the mind, which perhaps understandably enraged some of his academic colleagues. There was nothing wrong with individual Tasmanian brains. There was something wrong with their collective brains. Isolation, self-sufficiency, caused the shriveling of their technology. Earlier I wrote that division of labor was made possible by technology, but it is more interesting than that. Technology was made possible by division of labor. Market exchange calls forth innovation. Now at last it becomes clear why the erectus hominids saw such slow technological progress. They and their descendants, the Neanderthals, lived without trade. Recall how Neanderthal tools were sourced within an hour's walk of their use. So, in effect, each erectus hominid tribe occupied a virtual Tasmania cut off from the collective brain of wider population. Tasmania is about the size of the Irish Republic. By the time Abel Tasman pitched up in 1642, it held probably about 4,000 hunter-gatherers divided into 9 tribes, and they lived mainly off seals, seabirds, and wallabies, which they killed with wooden clubs and spears. That means that there were only a few hundred young adults on the entire island who were learning new skills at any one time. If, as seems to be the case everywhere, culture works by faithful imitation with a bias towards imitating prestigious individuals, in other words, copy the expert, not the parent or the person closest to hand, then all it would take for certain skills to be lost would be a handful of unlucky accidents in which the most prestigious individual had forgotten or mislearned a crucial step or even got to his grave without teaching an apprentice. Suppose, for example, that an abundance of seabirds led one group to eschew fishing for a number of years until the last maker of fishing tackle had died, or that the best barbed spear maker on the island fell off a cliff one day, leaving no apprentice. His barbs went on being used for some years, but once they had all broken, suddenly there was nobody who could make them. Acquiring a skill costs a lot of time and effort. Nobody could afford to learn barb making from scratch. People concentrated on learning the skills that they could watch firsthand. Bit by bit, Tasmanian technology simplified. The most difficult tools and complex skills were lost first because they were the hardest to master without a master to learn from. Tools are in effect a measure of the extent of the division of labor, and, as Adam Smith argued, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. The Tasmanian market was too small to sustain many specialized skills. Imagine if 4,000 people from your hometown were plonked on an island and left in total isolation for 10 millennia. How many skills and tools do you think they could preserve? Wireless telephone? Double entry bookkeeping? Suppose one of the people in your town was an accountant. You could teach double entry bookkeeping to a youth, but would the youth or the youth pass it on forever? On other Australian islands, much of the same happened as on Tasmania. On Kangaroo Island and Flinders Island, human population petered out, but probably by extinction a few thousand years after isolation. Flinders is a fertile island that should be a paradise, but the 100 or so people it could support were far too small a population to sustain the technology of hunter-gathering. The Tiwi people, isolated on 2 islands north of Darwin for 5,500 years, also reversed the ratchet of accumulating skills and slipped back into a simpler tool set. The Torres Islanders lost their art of canoe making, causing the anthropologist W.H.R. Rivers to puzzle over the disappearance of the useful arts. It seemed the hunter-gathering lifestyle was doomed if too isolated. The Australian mainland, by contrast, experienced steady technological progress. Where Tasmanian spears merely had fire-hardened wood points, on the mainland spears acquired detachable tips, stone barbs, and woomera spear throwers. It is no coincidence that the mainland had long-range trade, so that the inventions and luxuries could be sourced from distant parts of the land. Shell beads have been moving long distances across Australia since at least 30,000 years ago. Pearl and baler shells, pendants from the north coast, moved through at least 8 tribal areas to reach the far south. More than 1,000 miles from where it had been harvested, growing in sacredness as they went. Pichera, a tobacco-like plant, moved from Queensland. The best stone axes traveled up to 500 miles from where they were mined. In contrast to Tasmania, Tierra del Fuego, an island not much bigger than Tasmania, home to not many more people and generally rather colder and less hospitable, possessed a race of people who, when Charles Darwin met them in 1834, set bait for fish, nets for seals, and snares for birds, used hooks and harpoons, bows and arrows, canoes and clothing, all made from specialized tools and skills. The difference is that the Fuegians were in fairly frequent contact with other people across the Strait of Magellan, so that they could relearn lost skills or import new tools from time to time. All it took was an occasional incomer from the mainland to keep technology from regressing. Networking in the Near East. The lesson is stark. Self-sufficiency was dead tens of thousands of years ago. Even the relatively simple lifestyle of a hunter-gatherer cannot exist without a large population exchanging ideas and skills. The importance of this notion cannot be emphasized too strongly. The success of human beings depends crucially, but precariously, on numbers and connections. A few hundred people cannot sustain a sophisticated technology. Trade is a vital part of that story. Vast though it is, Australia itself may have suffered from this isolation effect. Recall that it was colonized 45,000 years ago by pioneering beachcombers spreading east from Africa along the shores of Asia. The vanguard of such a migration must have been small in number and must have traveled comparatively light. The chances are that they had only a sample of the technology available to their relatives back at the Red Sea crossing. This may explain why Australian Aboriginal technology, although it developed and elaborated steadily over the ensuing millennia, was lacking in so many features of the Old World. Elastic weapons, for example, such as bows and catapults, were unknown, as were ovens. It was not that they were primitive or that they had mentally regressed. It was that they had arrived in only a subset of technologies. It did not have a dense enough population and therefore a large enough collective brain to develop them much further. The quote-unquote Tasmanian effect may also explain why technological progress has been so slow and erratic in Africa after 160,000 years ago. It explains the periodic bursts of modern tools found in South African sites like Pinnacle Point, Blombos Cave, and Clayseas River. Despite the invention of exchange, the continent was like a patchwork of virtual Tasmanias. As Steve Shannon and his colleagues have calculated, whenever the right combination of, say, seafood, fresh water, and fertile savannas produced local population explosions, technology would have grown sophisticated in proportion to the number of people networked by exchange to sustain and develop it, in proportion to the scale of the collective intelligence. But when a river dried up, or deserts advanced, and human populations collapsed or shrank, technology would simplify again. Human cultural progress is a collective enterprise, and it needs a dense collective brain. Thus, the extraordinary change in technology and cultural tradition that seems to have flourished more than 30,000 years ago in Western Asia and the Near East, the so-called Upper Paleolithic Revolution, may be explained by a dense population, fed by an increasingly intensive and vegetarian hunter-gathering lifestyle, and with the close contact between tribes. The people of Southwest Asia were in a position to accumulate more and more skills and technologies than any previous human populations. A large, interconnected population meant faster cumulative invention, a surprising truth even to this day, as Hong Kong and Manhattan Islands demonstrate. As the economist Julian Simon put it, population growth leading to diminishing returns is fiction. The introduced increase in productivity is scientific fact. And one of those inventions was farming, which is the subject of Chapter 4. It is right to end the hunter-gatherer chapter, though, by remembering what happened to the Tasmanians. In the early 1800s, white sealers began to arrive along the island's coast, and it was not long before the Tasmanians were eagerly meeting the sealers to trade with them, proving that 10,000 years of limited exchange had done nothing to dampen their innate enthusiasm for barter. The sealers' dogs were especially sought after, being deer hounds that could easily run down kangaroos. In exchange, sad to relate, Tasmanians sold women to the sealers as concubines. Once white farmers arrived, relations between the two peoples deteriorated, and eventually the whites sent bounty hunters to kill the natives, then rounded up the survivors and exiled them to Flinders Island, where they eked out the last days in misery.